Good morning, everybody. My name is Tracy Skrabal. I'm a coastal scientist with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And like Spencer, I think I've been working on these about 100 years, since graduate school in the 18th century. But anyway, today I'm going to show you some case studies. And just as a way of introduction, as I said, I work for the Coastal Federation. We've been involved in this since about the mid-90s. And for the shameless plug, we are a nonprofit. This is the type of work we do: education, outreach, restoration, and advocacy. If you're not a member, today is a great day to join. And there, I've said it. Anyway, what I want to do today is take you through this suite of options. Now you all in this room understand that we're not talking about single approach. We're talking about a suite of options. I'm going to take you through some case studies of that suite of options. What I'm not going to do is really weigh in on or debate whether something is a living shoreline by whatever definition, regulatory or otherwise. I'm going to show you all who are designers and agency folks what's possible and point out living shoreline features even in a project you may not think is a living shoreline. So I want to just cover that range of options for you. So again, what we're talking about, just you have a pretty good sense of this already, and this was from a previous talk. That's why I still have the definition up there. But what I wanted to show you is, you know, within any gradation of your shoreline, there are things that we can do that would qualify it as a living shoreline project or restoration. We look at every shoreline differently. So we may incorporate 2 or 3 different types of living shoreline parameters or options within these lists. Or it may just be one. But I just want you all to understand that when you look at a shoreline, as Spencer said, you need to look at it in a holistic way. And I think it was touched on earlier, but a lot of times erosion, people look at the erosion from boat wakes or storm energy, but they don't look behind them at what's coming off the land, which in many cases is very important into what's happening in that bank and erosion. So that's be my first bit of advice. I don't want to forget to say that. Always pay attention to both types of sources of erosion. So I'm going to take you through these options, going from no action all the way through what we call traditional hardening approaches and any sort of increasing amounts of structural elements. I put this slide in here because no action, everybody goes, yeah. But seriously, no action is a possibility, especially when you're in pre-design. This house, lest you feel too sorry for them, is in the backside of an inlet hazard zone at Figure 8 Island, and that's pretty much what it looked like when I visited them under construction at their request. And they asked, can we do something to stabilize the shoreline with vegetation? I'm like, no. So they went on, and his question was, do I have 5 years in this house? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe. He said, well, I'm good then. And he went on to build a pool right here, and then these bags followed. So no action. He could have put that house further back. Still would have been in a dangerous area, but that's just ridiculous. So first of options that I want to talk about is the beach nourishment or beach fill as an option. Again, we can debate about the habitat trading. I think Spencer did a great job of pointing out that what we're talking about is people have the opportunity here within 1 or 2 days to put a bulkhead or riprap project in. So we're looking at these as what else could we do that is not that. In this particular case, this is Cape Lookout Lighthouse, Cape Lookout National Seashore. They had an erosion problem threatening their structures, and the other alternative that was potentially designed for this was a pretty good sized bulkhead. So the folks at Cape Lookout decided that they wanted to do something more natural. They'd had a sandy beach which was lost in this location, and so they basically bought time with the placement of beach fill. Again, we can debate. Sandy beach was there before, sandy beach is there now, no structure is there. I must tell you that I don't know if they've had to renourish, but it falls within the suite of options. It provides erosion control, and no structure has been necessary, basically setting yourself back in time. You saw this photo from Spencer. I'm sorry to repeat a couple of photos, but what I want to just point out is in some cases you can pretty much go out and plant marsh grass without doing anything with the grades. In many cases, that's not going to be an option because you've eroded back behind those elevations that would sustain marsh plants. And so in some cases, you're talking about the need to, especially if you have an over-steepened bank, to grade that bank, so what we call a cut bank and fill. So you might be taking out the top part of that bank, especially if you're, over-steepened up in this area, and just restoring a planting grade that you're able to sustain both low marsh and high marsh. In other cases, as I said, you're really just talking about replanting. By the time we get to many of these shorelines, the erosion is such that that's not a viable option. This is just an example of one that was large scale, done years and years and years ago, decades ago, by Steve Broom at NC State University. Spencer may have had something to do with this. This was a case where they had a lot of very appropriate grades, and they went out with a tomato planter and planted acres and acres and acres of marsh. Now the point I want to make on this is they didn't change the erosion energy here. The energy is the same. What they did was set themselves back in time, restore what had been lost, and basically allow erosion to continue, and eventually they'd have to restore this marsh again unless it's able to keep pace a little better with erosion forces in place. Biologs, just touched on a little bit of this. My experience with biologs is somewhat limited, but I've attended a couple of trainings on Chesapeake Bay and done a couple of them myself. When you see these heavily used in Chesapeake Bay area, you most often see them with a little stone at the base of these. I'm going to show you a case study, but I just want to point out that what you're talking about is something that's sort of at the soft end of structural approaches. It's a cocoa mat fiber that is designed to biodegrade over time. Depending on the energy conditions, it can biodegrade in about 15 minutes, or it can biodegrade over several years. We've got a project that we did, where we used it because there was no room to grade a bank back, and so we used it in place of a bulkhead, and there's still remnants of that 10 years later, and the shoreline looks fantastic. So it's kind of odd. It doesn't hold up as well with wave energy of any kind, or in saltwater situations. You see these more used in freshwater, but I think Maryland and Virginia has done a pretty good job of deciding that where you can get more life out of these is where you put stone at the base, and these are two stakes that hold it into place. They're shore parallel. Show you a photo. This happens to be my brother's property on Chesapeake Bay. What you can't see in this photo is that there was a pretty high cut bank here, over-steepened bank, a fair amount of erosion. This is very close to the mouth of this creek, looking straight across the bay at Tangier Island. Bulkheads all the way from here to the mouth. You get a lot of energy that comes in during storms and runs right along that bulkhead and then kicks the butt of my brother's shoreline. So my brother is as green as I am, if not more, and wanted to do something else, and this is what you call slave labor with my children. And my husband and my sister, and some beer was had. But we used 2 rows of biologs. Again, we're experimenting here because it didn't cost us a lot. This upper row is really, we wanted to sort of look at the tiered effect. I want to point out something here. So we graded this bank down. It was absolutely necessary. And by the way, my brother pushed his house back 100 feet from his original design location because his sister is bossy. But you'll see in a moment that it was the right thing to do. So he bought himself a great deal of time, even with sea level rise, by pushing his house back 100 feet. So we have an upper tier of biolog. We have a lower tier. Right here, eroded away, 15 minutes. Actually, it was more like 2 weeks. Storm came in and eroded that right away. Again, we get a great deal of energy running along shore of this. It's a narrow creek, so you're not getting it from long fetch. You're getting a huge current running along from the mouth of this creek. So we lost this section, replanted it, and again, no marsh vegetation here before. It was a cut bank with some struggling little trees. This is what it looks like pretty much today. It did beautifully. We planted low marsh, high marsh. We planted some upper dune grass species, a few shrubs, and this is what it looks like. I always have to say this. So on both sides of these are massive bulkheads. This summer, the property owner on the right side asked my brother if they could have their kids' wedding pictures taken on this dock because they like the green shoreline, which I thought was pretty awesome. But anyway, this is above the energy that I normally would have thought biologs worked, but they're working actually very well. The only place we have a problem is where this shoreline transitions into the bulkhead next door, because we're still getting erosion there. But not a great deal, and certainly we've had to replant some of the low marsh there, but for the most part, it's perfectly stable. So I'm going to get a little more into these combination or hybrid projects, and these are anything from stone to oyster bags to oyster domes. So I'll just take you through some of the projects that we have in this state and a few from out of state. Stone containment structures. This is not something that we see a lot here, but it is something that was used and may still be used heavily in Chesapeake Bay. It was at one point funded, cost shared up to 50% of the cost of the project when I was a consultant up there in the upper reaches of these Chesapeake Bay creeks, where they're really trying to enhance their juvenile fish nursery areas. And the source of erosion up there is boat wake, almost entirely boat wake, and you get these big undercut banks that just fall off with big trees. And so what they did was they would pay for basically that cut and fill that I told you. They would actually wash down the banks or use equipment to cut the bank down to restore the planting grades, because again, these boat wakes just take it off a little bit at a time, but it's every day. So you can lose these shoreline, you can lose the marshes in these upper reaches very quickly, both fresh and tidal salt. So you put the bank down, and then I'm sorry that these photos are a little tough to see for you guys today because of the lighting situation, but what you have are stone small groins. They're called containment cells. The stone is really designed to keep the fill in place while the marsh does its job. You then plant it very heavily with marsh, and in a short amount of time, usually 1 to 2 years, you've got a very stable shoreline where the rock is pretty much lost, or not lost, it's pretty much becomes incidental to the functioning of these shorelines. But there's enough of it that when you get that boat wake erosion, it helps that marsh to establish till it can do a dissipation on its own. So useful, we've done one project of it here just to demonstrate its use, but for the most part in our upper creeks, we're not seeing the type of erosion that they have and the type of boat use up, that were up in these creeks in Maryland and Virginia. Spencer already talked about this. This is, again, a wooden sill. We used to call these wooden breakwaters, but in fact they are a form of a sill. And remember that a sill is that structure that's placed channelward of where your marsh is growing or your marsh will be reestablished. And so again, this is the one that has the smallest footprint, if you will. Some limitations in their use in terms of their ability to dissipate, but in the right location, these do a great job at low cost and low design. These are Spencer's slides. Thank you, Spencer. I show this often. I'm sorry, many of you may have seen these who have seen these talks before. This is a project that was an incidental sill. Spencer showed you one shot of this. I'm going to show you the series. This was an illegal bulkhead that the state caught before they were allowed to backfill. And so they modified it slightly, but it really is a wooden sill. So this is 2 years after construction. Pay attention to the wetlands that are behind here. It's on the noose, right, Spencer? Pamlico, okay. This is what it looks like about 5 to 9 years. I don't know that we know exactly, but you can kind of see it wasn't a high energy site anyway. It's doing beautifully on its own with just this wooden structure and the marsh that was planted and then volunteered behind. Also pay attention to, this really nice row of shrubs. We're very, very interested when we do any shoreline project in that gradation from low marsh, intertidal, into the shrub zone, into the tree zone. We're really, really focused on connecting the riparian zone to our intertidal and marsh zone down to the subtidal. That is being lost faster than any other habitat in along our estuary. So we pay very close attention to this, and I would ask you all too. The other thing is that we don't just look at these as habitat projects. We look at these as water quality improvement projects or water quality protection projects. So when you can maintain that marsh to riparian tree on up to trees, you're doing a great service in erosion control, stormwater management, removing those nutrients, fertilizers out of the ground, and I'll show you a case where we actually studied that. It's not difficult to do if you have willing landowners. So anyway, this is what it looks like 5 to 9 years after. Property changed hands. They pulled out the sill, don't know why, but you can kind of see what happened. Right away we lose the marsh, and then right after that they built a bulkhead. So it's a pretty dramatic indication of what we got, what we lost, what you can expect from an erosion standpoint and from an intertidal zone standpoint. It's cause and effect. So I want to talk a little bit about oyster shells. Lexia is going to give you a nice little how-to primer working with oyster shells. We've worked with oysters a great deal now in the last 5 years, if not more. Time flies. But use of oysters, I think Carolyn did a lot of the what I call pioneering work in loose oyster shells. It's now getting much more commonplace. We're seeking to find what the upper energy regime is that you can feel comfortable about using loose oyster shell. We've had a couple that I would say failed, but that was an experiment and we learned something. The use of oyster bags, etc. I'll show you different examples, but these can be either linear oyster structures where you're basically creating a sill but using a different medium than rock, or they can be patch reefs offshore. We have some of these around Jones Island. I think Lexia will speak to them. But these patch reefs have the ability to perform some erosion control functions, and this is not uncommon in the Chesapeake Bay either in some areas. So this is Carolyn's project, and I just put this in here. She spoke about it. This is one of the two shorelines we're going to look at today. It's on the backside of Pivers Island, but it gives you a sense of how the state comes in and builds these. We work with DMF on a number of oyster reef projects, as in offshore reef projects, and this is how they build them with great precision, by the way. But you can see from 2000 to 2006, and I think you all built these in stages. As I looked at these photos, they moved along the shoreline, and every time you see the oyster reef go in, you wait 2 years, and there's a beautiful marsh behind it. So this is Carolyn and her crew planting, and in the 2001 era, and then you can kind of see from 2003 to 2014, I'd say you have a very stable shoreline with great habitat elements grading right on up into, I think you have some shrubs or scrubs up there, but a really nice example of where loose oyster shell, marsh plantings, and marsh volunteering in is the perfect approach. We have a property, it's 58 acres on Stump Sound for any of you all that are up that way, that we use to experiment and demonstrate a number of different living shoreline techniques. We own about a mile of shoreline and it's eroding, it's right on the ICW. So we started with rock sill, and that has done very well, but over time we've sort of experimented with less and less, lowering the elevation, not using any fill. That's a point I want to make. We used to almost always add fill when we were working into erosion areas where we'd lost that low marsh, and so the grades did not support. Nowadays, because of what we've learned from Carolyn's work and how our own projects are functioning, is that we don't add fill anymore, almost never. We basically will plant low marsh even where it's too deep for that marsh to grow, and then wait until the sediment builds up. The marsh can help with that process. I will say that it lengthens the time that it takes to reestablish that marsh. We used to be able to establish a really nice low marsh where your grades are perfect. In 2 years we could feel good about walking away from it. Now it's 3 to 4, and that's in most of our locations. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there, but we still think that it's the right thing to do, and we also really like leaving a zone of slightly deeper water where there is no marsh grass, but between that marsh and the sill itself. So we're all evolving. This is our property at Morris Landing. If any of you are around there, it's nice to go out there and look at different approaches. We've got an oyster bag sill. These are hand bagged with volunteers, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volunteers using a bobcat and a system that I'm happy to share with you if Lexia does not, but it's greatly enhanced our ability to crank these out by the tens of thousands, not the hundreds. So oyster bag sill. Some of the experimentation we've done here is we built a section of this with marl as the base of this structure. Oysters are a very limited commodity in this state, and they've gone from costing us about $1 a bushel to about $3.50 a bushel as we are competing with other states for our shell. And so we're trying to limit the amount of oyster shell. We know from our projects that the oysters will settle pretty much only on the front and the top of these structures, much less on the back side of these structures. So there is no sense wasting 2 or 3 rows of oyster shell under here that are not going to elevate the amount of recruitment that you see, and in fact you're just wasting shell we could be using somewhere else. So what we started by doing was creating that bottom 2 layers with loose marl, small marl. In this particular location, it did not work, and the reason it didn't work is these oyster bags that we placed on top slid right off of it like it was on a table. So that was something we learned. Even though it was a lot easier to do that, what we've had to do now is we actually bag the marl as we bag the oyster shell. So we use the people we like less to do the marl, and then we use the people we want to come back for the oyster shell. And they weigh about 3 times as much as the oyster bags, but they have great integrity and they interlock much better as the bottom 2 layers. Most of our structures are 2 bags high, 3 bags high, sometimes even 4, is that it holds that integrity and they hold together much better. So that was something we learned. We also, in the same location, have experimented with oyster domes. We've had very good success with oyster domes in other locations. This shoreline is very interesting. You can go at one end of the same shoreline and the recruitment is excellent. You can go about 200 feet away and it's not so good. It can be anything from a slight change in the orientation of the shoreline, the circulation, the elevation changes just slightly, even though we know where that sweet spot is. There are some factors that you have to just learn by being in a location, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be. But we're experimenting with using different approaches and combinations out here. Everything we do, we use volunteers for, being the Federation, and it's a great way for people to understand and take back this knowledge to their own shorelines or their own communities, and they also get a real sense of accomplishing something. In the background of this one, you can see we have oyster domes here. We paired these with a row of oyster bags and then a row of oyster domes deeper, where we know that we'll get the oysters growing on the top of the dome, so we're not wasting oyster shell, and we know that they work. And then in the background, a vinyl vertical wall sill that we wanted to watch how it performed. This is the vertical wall sill. One of the things we learned working with Steve Antonori, who's a contractor up in the Topsail area, is they did a number of these vertical walled sills along the intercoastal waterway on the backside of Topsail, and they were very, very effective. Even without planting, the low marsh really volunteered in behind these, and it had been too deep to even plant marsh behind it because of erosion. So we've been watching these, but the problem they had been experiencing somewhat is that on the cap board, they put cap boards on these up there, mostly so for aesthetics and also for people to walk on, which seems kind of creepy, but and that was causing a bit of a problem because you get energy up against that cap board. It pops them up, it rolls them down just a little bit. They were a little bit shaky, so we designed this one without a cap board just to let them see how that would affect their endurance. But for the most part, they've worked very well. Now I will say, this particular structure, you can see the open gap here. We've replanted this shoreline twice. We're going to replant it again this year. We've had about 50% mortality so far, more than we have with other structures. But it's an experiment, so we'll just keep going. Duke Marine Lab, this is the other shoreline that we're going to look at, built in 2002. What we had here was, you can see in the forefront, the NOAA bulkhead. In the way back, you can see a revetment. In between, there was a failing asbestos bulkhead. There was a flounder pin, I believe, an experimental flounder pin that arced out from the shoreline. So we basically recreated that arc because it was already an area that was fairly enclosed. And so what we did was we basically graded out the bank and put in a stone sill that connects both to the revetment at this end and the bulkhead at the other end. I like this because you can see three different approaches side by side by side. The source of erosion here and the energy is along shore. A very swift current runs right along this, so swift that I couldn't hold a survey rod in place without one of my interns holding my waist. So that's the kind of energy you're talking about here. It wasn't on and offshore nearly as much. This is another site where you'll see, where we were very excited about putting in other design elements. You can see us planting this shoreline with upper marsh, lower marsh. But one of the things we did here, which we tried, I'm sorry, let me show you this. It's a half a foot below mean high water, by the way. This is one that we felt, because of the type of energy coming in here, we could build this lower than we would for some of our other sill projects. And I think it was very, very successful. And because of this one, we actually, I've designed a number of them now much lower than I would have in the past. What I want to show you here is, so 5 years later, you've got low marsh, high marsh, but you also have in a great volunteering, for the most part, of cedars, of little pines, of all kinds of native grasses in this upper berm. And the reason is that we constructed this. You had, prior to this project, you had every bit of that runoff from these roads was coming up over the bulkhead that was there before. So you had not only an erosion problem, but you had stormwater runoff carrying all kinds of nasties. So it's very, very useful in many locations as you're looking at these shorelines to also pay attention to the fact that you don't want to do a nice marsh project and then not pay attention to the fact that you're getting some stormwater runoff from the top side that could create runnels, more erosion, move that fill. So what we did is we created what's called a reverse berm here. Reverse berm is nothing more than we dig a shallow trench here of, could be 6 inches, could be 12 inches, could be 18 inches, and then we use that to create a low berm. So now water running off of this road hits this trench, and because it's sandy soils, it goes into this trench and infiltrates. So problem solved, and you're not creating more of an erosion problem for the shoreline structure, shoreline project itself, and you get this beautiful habitat created here of these volunteered trees and shrubs. Bill Kirby-Smith, who's a research scientist here, did a monitoring of this and showed that 100% of stormwater runoff that was previously going over that bulkhead was now captured and infiltrated. That's a pretty good data set. We were pretty pleased with this. This is just recent photos that I took, and I'm sorry it's so dark. But I wanted to show you, since the time of this project, which I can't believe was 2002, how much the shoreline has grown up and diversified in terms of the plants that live here and the habitats, but also how successful it's been from an erosion standpoint. This is the backside again. You can still see a little bit of that remnant trench. It still functions exactly the way it was designed, and of course you've got these nice trees growing up here. I put this photo in here because, again, when we talk about habitat trading, yes, this structure is bumped out into our intertidal zone. We had to move oysters when we did this, which were growing on the flounder pins, which were vertical walls. However, look at what we've gotten in return. There's a revetment back here, and the water drops right off after that revetment. You have oysters growing on the revetment, but you do not have this intertidal. You do not have a connection with your riparian buffer. You do not have the ability for this shoreline to migrate landward with sea level rise. Likewise with this bulkhead. This has just been rebuilt. We're going to talk, I think Walt's going to talk about cost. There were some structural or some design or engineering constraints or limitations on why this couldn't be a shoreline. I would maintain, having looked at it, that we definitely could have done a living shoreline project here. The cost of this bulkhead is roughly $1,300 a foot. I could build you an island and still have money for a boat and a living shoreline thing here. But we just don't think creatively enough when we look at this. And you can see, I don't have to tell you what the differences are in ecosystem functions with this structure. I think, unfortunately, I urge you all who are engineers to just think a little bit out of the box. And yes, it would have been difficult to do this, and yes, we would have sacrificed some intertidal zone, but I would maintain that it would be well worth it. Off of the soapbox. This is a project up in Columbia on the Albemarle Sound. I put this in here, number one, because you get a nice look at what a sill looks like relative to a revetment. This is bald cypress shoreline, so fair amount of erosion here from boat wakes. And the reason I want to put this in here is I want to show you that you can work in these freshwater systems and get a really nice growth with these freshwater species, which I had to write down because I'm too old to remember them. But this was an experiment where we worked with Ellen Kolodny, who has a nursery up in Edenton. She's an excellent botanist, and we knew what was growing in the area, but we really wanted to sort of try different species as part of this project. And I just point out for all you guys, what did really well here were things like water millet, Zizaniopsis, pickerel weed, sawgrass, duck potato, bulrush, three square, soft rush. We also replanted bald cypress, which had fallen in at this location. So chokeberry, swamp rose, and cedars. And this site has done very, very well. Again, fairly high energy open fetch in this location. Would I rather not see a stone structure in front of these bald cypress? You betcha. But what we've gotten is a nice gradation, and we replanted back here with trees, so you're getting that nice gradation into the riparian buffer here. Another site on the Chowan River, also in a brackish shoreline. This is the Wildlife Resources Commission boat ramp and parking lot in that location. This is an area where we had a huge amount of stormwater runoff from a heavily used parking lot that's way too close to the shoreline, so we're getting water quality issues in addition to a failing bulkhead. So it was a great opportunity to partner with Wildlife Resources to do something different. What we did was, and you can see here, we pulled out that old bulkhead, we regraded the shoreline, pulled it back towards the parking lot. So we wanted to put in a full riparian buffer here. This is an area where bald cypress used to be growing. We had some old photos, and you can kind of see, we did this project in 2005, 2004, 5, and by 2007, again, those same species that I just mentioned to you, the bulrushes, the Zizaniopsis does really well in all of these environs. And again, we got a really nice gradation right on up to the parking lot. What I love about this is, once again, we also got a nice little stand of eelgrass, and this is not the first time we've seen this. This is not a shoreline where we saw eelgrass before, but it is a shoreline. Again, eelgrass is ephemeral, but the quiet spaces behind these structures, we saw it at Columbia, we saw it here, I just saw it at Carteret Community College, which I'll show you. But so you can see a reintroduction of these SAVs. Also, this is a case somebody mentioned about the openings. We do see erosion from funneled energy through these 5-foot gaps that we put in these structures to allow fish passage and circulation exchange. So what we did in this location, and I use this fairly regularly now, is a small section of a sill that is channel landward of the opening. It has to be no more than maybe half the height of a regular section of sill, and it just dissipates that energy so you don't see a big scour behind here. You could do the same thing with overlaps, but you're doubling the cost. There are other reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. So these work pretty well for us. But you can also see how mature this shoreline has gotten to be. Roanoke Island Festival Park. This is a big project we worked on. Again, a historic site, a lot of erosion, gets directly hit by hurricanes coming off of the Outer Banks or scraping across the Outer Banks. And again, Roanoke Island Festival Park is very historic. They had proposed a very large bulkhead for this location, and one of their commissioners said, no, I'm not going to agree to that. So we worked with the Corps on a project design. I learned a lot from this project design, and the reason is that I fought with Chuck Wilson about how close that sill needed to be and what the grade should be for establishing marsh grass, and he fought, correctly so, to keep more open water in this location. He wanted to see if he could get SAV behind here, and he also wanted to see if he could establish oyster shell layer or an oyster shell zone in a fairly low salinity. The answer is not very well. But so we ended up planting where plants would grow, but there's a gap here, a fairly deep gap where water can get through here. And we also replanted pines because this is an area that gets really hurt by hurricanes and the salt spray on the pines. So this was a full-scale restoration project. It is very stable. This is after Hurricane Isabel, I believe, and you can see the pines took a huge hit, but the replanted pines, they replanted again, and it's a narrow fringe of marsh. It makes me a little scared when I look at this, but it is very stable. The structure is huge. It's a Corps project, need I say more? But it's doing the job. It's not a big bulkhead. Water comes through. Fish are all in this place. SAV did not establish well here, but it was a good thing to look at. But it's highly successful, and I learned to leave my grades deeper by watching this project. Carteret Community College, right up here in Morehead City. It's not a site we're going to look at, but you can go and take a look at it if you'd like. What it looked like when we got involved is this is the CMAST building right here, which is a large research structure, houses NC State, Sea Grant, and other folks in there. Built way too close to the shoreline, multi-million-dollar building. What had been used decades ago were concrete pillow bags along the entire shoreline and dumped riprap, everything, concrete, small cars, I don't know, everything. We can argue whether this is a living shoreline when you look at the size of it. I'm only going to point out that there are different elements here that have been introduced. This is a highly engineered project, particularly in front of this building. But remember, the president of CCC wanted to do something that was not just a big bulkhead, because those concrete pillows were not only hideous to look at, but they were breaking up. They weren't really doing the work that they should be doing. And he did not want anybody to touch this area, which they use for drying their nets and laying out a lot of their student work. And so there was no choice but to go forward. And he did not want to pull out those concrete pillows. So they were going to remain a very hard structure. And so the design goal was to create an alternative that had living shoreline elements, but still provided him with the protection he needed for that multi-million-dollar structure too close to the shoreline. So what was designed for this site by some professional engineers were the breakwater systems that Spencer showed you. A stone sill here, which I would agree with Spencer is a large structure, but needed to be so to establish the grade change in this very narrow area. And this is a perch beach, no doubt about it. An oyster shell bag sill, reef balls, and then we also incorporated a really nice freshwater stormwater wetland that outfalls into this area to capture runoff from here and pre-treat it. So again, looked at this fairly holistically. This is what it looked like before. It is lovely. There is no liability here whatsoever for people walking on the shoreline. Thing I'll also point out is the grade change for me standing at the top here to me standing down here is over my head, so probably 6 or 8 feet. So it was fairly high difference in grades. Just another shot. You can see how close that structure is to the shoreline. Another shot of the pillow bags. And again, you're talking about, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet grade change. You can't really see it there, but it's steep. So the project is actually the designer came in and brought in a great deal of fill, covered up every one of those bags, and then replanted. So graded out to these breakwaters. Could you have done this with the sill? Yes, you could have, but this is a great opportunity to introduce embayments to try to see if we could create some a little more diversity of habitat and still get the protection for the structure that you wanted. This is a couple years into it. Alexia has planted this site and worked with thousands and thousands of people. She's very near and dear to her heart. And the site is very stable. It has done very, very well from the standpoint of erosion control, but also introduction of different living shoreline elements. You've got high marsh here, you've got some low marsh. There actually is some SAVs that I understand reintroduce themselves into the embayments. And then you've got, again, an area of riparian shrubs, I think is what's planted up here, and some things have volunteered in. It's big. And it's highly structured. But again, the alternative here was another big bulkhead. So something to debate or discuss. This is looking in the other direction from the pier that overlooks the oyster laboratory. These are oyster bags. This is the first oyster bag sill that we did. It's 4 bags high. Again, this structure stays in place, so you're only working in this area here. And then we did oyster domes behind here. That's about 2 years after. We saw a fair amount of buildup of sediment, not only behind the structure, but in front of the structure. I was very surprised how much sediment built up in front of the structure, almost to the top of the bags as it is today. And this is pretty much what it looks like today. Again, we didn't change the erosion energy here. We're not allowing the shoreline to migrate landward. We don't get a riparian here. This is the freshwater wetland, by the way, so you can kind of see it. It does a nice job of keeping some of the nasties out of the creek here, out of the sound. This is Bogue Sound. Just an aerial view, I'm up on the top of Seamass. You can spit on this shoreline out one of the windows, but you can kind of see it's very stabilized. The tombola that was built, this is called the tombola that attaches the shoreline to this structure, has done a nice job of stabilizing, and the vegetation has matured nicely in here. It's also a great spot for kids and students to come out here and do some nice projects. Took a picture just the other day just to show you we had really beautiful growth in 2 years of oysters on these oyster domes, better than we could have hoped. Interestingly, when I went back a couple weeks ago and took pictures, we still have small spat and small oysters growing on the lower part, which is where it was pretty dominant before. Now we get a great deal of oysters on the top of this, thank you, which I found really interesting. The other thing that was really interesting is that we've got a lot of eelgrass growing in, and I went in there and yanked on it just to make sure it wasn't just rolled in there, but it's actually attached all through the oyster domes. Thought that was pretty interesting. These are the oyster bags themselves. Again, what we learned here is those oysters are going to settle on the top and the front of these structures, not so much on the back side. Not enough food, whatever it is, not enough circulation, so we learned. I put this in here. This is a revetment project, so a riprap revetment where you had a fair amount of erosion, you had a nice healthy marsh, and the owner was insistent on putting in a revetment between where this nice marsh was, but erosion in this location was storm-induced. It would get behind the marsh and scarp his bank out. So they were mostly about the perception of erosion and wanting to create a buffer for themselves. So what we did was we designed it such that 2/3 of that revetment, and by the way, they wanted a very large revetment, in my opinion, 2/3 of that was covered up and replanted with high marsh species, so that what you see here is a full-size revetment, and a big one that is 2/3 trenched in, and a pretty healthy upper marsh and shrub zone. You really don't even see the rock until you get to the top of this. So just an example of where, even if you're using what I would call highly structured shoreline projects, you can introduce living shoreline elements and have it both ways. What you don't get is you don't get anything that dissipates that energy, so eventually you will get water right up against this, especially with sea level rise and increased storm intensity. So we haven't done anything that we would get with some of our other projects, but we've gotten, at this point, 98, that can't be possible. We've gotten that many years of a pretty nice shoreline. So that's what I have. It is not inclusive of all the types of approaches, but I'll take questions, and I'll be around the rest of the day.
Plenty of time for questions.
There at the Carteret Community College site, what do you think caused that sediment to accrete in front of the structure? Do you have any idea what caused that, or what feature was there that allowed that to happen?
Well, obviously, the oyster bag sill is a hard structure in effect. I think what I didn't realize, and this is neither bad nor good, is there's a lot of sediment in that system right there, moving around. At the time that we got involved in this project, it was actively eroding. We know that from talking with Skip Kemp at the oyster area, but so apparently either it was eroding because when the storms would come in there, it would scour in front of those concrete bags, which are essentially a revetment and very steep one. So you were getting a structural scour in front of there so that even sediment rolling in wasn't going to stay there because you couldn't get marsh established. So my guess is, you put a sill out there, you get marsh reestablishment on the channelward side, on the landward side, but you also, for whatever reason, had enough ability, at least when I was out there a few weeks ago, it is built up all the way to the crest of that structure, and that's about 3 feet. So I didn't walk out there and see whether it just, whether it grades out gently or there's a mound of sediment in front of there, but that was surprising, and I don't usually see that.
Any questions for Tracy?
Okay. Thank you all.